Hi everyone, it's Paul Tilley and welcome to Unit 6, Project Communication Planning. The material for this unit can be found in Module 6 and readings in Chapter 10 and 11 of the textbook. Communications planning is really an important contributor to overall project success. It sets clear guidelines for how and when information will be shared, as well as who's responsible for what needs to be done. The plan helps streamline communication through the most efficient and effective channels so the project's teams and the stakeholders have a good idea of what's going on. The communication plan strengthens every project by setting clear expectations of how and updates will be shared, and also establishes written documentation and a paper trail for anyone if they need to ask questions. A good communications plan will reduce random requests for project updates, clearly outline the important project information where it is to be found, increases visibility of the project and its status, provides opportunities for feedback to be shared, and it boosts productivity of team meetings and ensures the project continues to align with the project goals. So let's look at the elements of communication planning. Every good communication management plan really should answer to 5 W's. Who, what, when, where, and why. Now, if we look at those in terms of how they're applied to communication planning, well, let's look at the communication requirements first. The communication plan really is an element that defines what you're doing. What is the project? It describes the different touch points or communications your project will need to do in order to succeed. It also includes the goals. Every project communication should have a purpose, otherwise it shouldn't be happening. You're just wasting people's time. You also need the communication method to be considered. Which method works best? So this component explains where the project communication will happen and how it's going to happen. Communication frequency comes in. How often do you want to communicate? We need to set clear goals of the intervals, and that would give us clear expectations of what people should expect. So, for example, team stand-up meetings might happen daily, whereas written status reports could happen weekly or even bi-weekly. Communication also needs to be targeted. Who needs to receive this information? We don't want to define who's going to get it. So this component really includes the person responsible for managing each project communication as well as who receives it. So the basic steps of putting together a communication plan include: list your project communication needs. Determine the size of the project, the nature of the work to be done, the client's preferences. These sorts of things are going to play into that decision in terms of the communication needs. We also got to think about the types of communication that the project is going to need in order to succeed. The second step is really to define the purpose of the communication. Why are we sending out this message? What needs to be communicated? So we need to ensure that every communication has a real reason for being. Thirdly, we need to look at the method. How are we going to communicate this? Look at past projects. What was the preferred method then? What works for the audience? Do they want it written? Do they want it electronic? Do they want face-to-face? So we really need to consult with the users and think about the tools and the user preferences in that context. The fourth step, we need to think about frequency. How often are we going to communicate? Do we set regular meetings? Normally, regular meetings would be helpful in order to ensure that there's a regular flow of information. We also need to think about identifying the stakeholders and relate who is going to get this information. We need to assign ownership and create some degree of accountability. Here's an example of a kind of a matrix type setup that answers those basic questions and puts it in a single page, quick and dirty format. We divide it into various categories: the audience, the strategy, what we're going to use, the key messages, the channels, the date and time, and who's responsible for it, the owner. So as we go down through the various types of communication, we can see that some of them go to everybody, some of them just go to senior leadership, some of them go to middle managers. The strategy is the type of the tone of the message, these sorts of things. The key message, what needs to be communicated. The channel would include, is it written, is it verbal, is it electronic, and so on. The date and time might be a specific date, or it might be a range within a certain time frame. We will do this. And the owner is the person who's responsible for doing it. And we could potentially add who is going to receive the message. Next, we'll look at how we get information out. How do we distribute it? So we think about the distribution system. We really need to get the right information to the right people. And we need to do it in a timely way that works for them. So effective distribution of information relies on a selection of really a number of tools. And those tools will be very dependent on the message and the receipts. We could put it down into three basic things. What is the type of information that needs to be distributed? What is the audience requirements? And what is the timeline? Many methods of distribution are available. We think about project team meeting. We think about individual one-on-one meetings. We think about stakeholder meetings, video conferencing, conference calls, email, a web portal, which is basically a website, and collaborative work management tools such as Zoom. We can generally boil those down into two basic categories: face-to-face or hard copy/electronic. Face-to-face meetings have some benefits. They can be formal, they can be informal, one-on-one, could be in groups. Face-to-face communication really allows for gauging of the responses. You can see people's faces, and allows you to ensure that people are understanding what the message is, or to better ensure that people are understanding what the message is. Meetings could be costly, though, if you got to fly people in, particularly if you're bringing them in from other provinces or other countries. We want to ensure that the meetings are productive too. We talk about meetings and what do we need in order to make an effective meeting. We really need to think about that. We got to plan our meeting. We got to make sure we have an agenda for the meeting. We got to make sure the right participants are at the meeting, and then follow through on that. So if our participants are required to have information, make sure they got it before the meeting, and make sure they've given it some thought before the meeting. That way we can get an educated response. We also need to think about the meeting itself and how the meeting is handled. Meetings often need some sort of facilitation. Someone needs to manage the meeting. This includes ensuring the agenda is followed, and the meeting starts and ends on time, and the documentation is covered, and the to-dos and the decisions are recorded. That's important. So if there's lots of to-dos, we need to assign those to-dos to somebody and to set a hard timeline on them. From a hard copy or electronic communications point of view, which is really non-face-to-face, these are very common today, especially in light of COVID. We think about using electronic communications. So managers may choose to provide hard copies or electronic copies, and this could be as simple as sending a PDF through email, or sending a copy through fax, or any number of things like that. You want to make sure that you keep the original version. So electronic versions need to be kept. So good record keeping is important. If we think about electronic communications, there's lots of ways to do it, and probably the way that's most common now is some sort of a project portal. This just means that you create a website, an intranet, that not everyone has access to. It's kind of password protected, we'll call it. That information can be put in and people can get it. So it's a single cloud-based site. And we think about Microsoft SharePoint, or Google has the equivalent in terms of a Google Drive. All of those things allow for people to access it and use it. Project planners may also choose to use collaborative meetings such as Zoom or MS Teams, and individuals can come to those virtually. It's very similar to face-to-face meetings. It brings many of the advantages of face-to-face meetings when you can actually see people. So it's always good to have cameras on. And again, the basic rules of a meeting, the to-dos established, all those things would apply as well. So we've looked at the pros and cons, and we've looked at the types. We've looked at the pros and cons, and we looked at the different types of meetings that can be had. So you got to think about your project as a whole before your project starts, and think about the communication plan in light of those things. We might want to ask, well, what are the different types of communication tools that we're going to use? Again, it's going to depend on our audience. The frequency, the basic goal, who owns it, who's going to be responsible for it, and the audience. If we think about those things up front and plot them out, that's what's called a communication plan. Thanks for watching. If you ever have any questions, please let me know. See you next time.